Merciful gods, there's a heartbeat in the ash. She's turning blue. The words escaped Alara Vale's lips before she could choke them back. It was the pale, dead hour before dawn. A biting frost clung to the stone walls of the Crimson Palace, turning the refuse behind the eastern wing into a jagged landscape of waste and rot. Alara had just heaved the heavy iron lid of the waste container when she saw her. There she was, Princess Nisara Nocturne. Scarcely a few months old, the infant was curled among the damp ash and discarded bones, wrapped in blood-stained royal silk that shimmered even in the filth. Alara's heart didn't just race. It felt like it had been lanced by an ice-cold blade. No, 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 Alara whispered, plunging her hands into the grime without a thought for the stains on her uniform. Little one, stay with me. Don't let the cold take you. Not here. The infant was freezing, her skin the color of a winter moon. Alara pulled her out, clutching the tiny, shivering body against her chest, shielding the princess from the biting wind with her own tattered shawl. I have to get you to the healers, Alara gasped, turning to run toward the servants' entrance. Help. Someone help. I've found the... What have you done? Thank you for joining me on this journey into the heart of the Crimson Realm. If you can feel Alara's courage and you're rooting for justice, hit that subscribe button right now. Drop a comment below telling me, would you have risked your life for that cry in the dark? Stay tuned, because tomorrow I'm bringing you an even more shocking tale of betrayal and hidden royalty. You won't believe what's coming. Now, let us begin. The scream sliced through the silence like a silver dagger. Seraphine Drax, the High Caretaker, stood silhouetted against the palace lights, her face a mask of calculated horror. Oh, sweet mother of blood, you were throwing her away. Guards. Seize her. The maid is murdering the heir. Alara's breath hitched. What? No. I found her in the bin. I pulled her out. Liar. Seraphine shrieked, her voice echoing off the high spires. I saw you. You try to discard her like trash because she represents the life you'll never have. Within heartbeats, for armored sentinels surrounded Alara, spears leveled at her throat. A guard ripped the crying Nisara from her arms with a force that nearly snapped Alara's wrists. Do not move, rat, the guard spat. Please listen to me. Alara begged, holding up her trembling, ash-stained hands. She was dying. Look at her eyes. She's been poisoned. She needs a physician. Silence. A heavy gauntlet struck Alara across the face. She staggered, falling into the frozen mud, the metallic taste of blood filling her mouth. But the physical pain vanished the moment the atmosphere shifted. The air grew heavy, smelling of ancient ozone and old blood. King Malachar Nocturne stepped into the courtyard like a shadow given form. Tall, imposing, crowned in jagged obsidian, his eyes burned with a crimson rage that seemed to stop the very rotation of the world. Nisara. His voice was a low, terrifying rumble, the sound of an avalanche starting. He took his daughter from the guard, his jaw tightening so hard the bones seemed ready to crack as he saw the filth smeared on her royal swaddling. Then his gaze fell on Alara. You, he breathed, the word vibrating with inhuman malice. Alara shrank back, the juice of the refuse bin staining her white apron, her entire frame convulsing with terror. My king, please. I went to empty the bins. I found her. I saved her. Do not speak. He handed the child to a waiting healer and stalked toward Alara. He didn't shout. His voice was a cold edge against her throat. You treated the blood of Nocturne like common waste. You threw my legacy into the rot. No, Majesty. I swear on my soul. The blow was effortless and brutal. Alara's head snapped to the side, and she collapsed onto the wet gravel, gasping for air. Malachar reached down, his fingers locking into her hair, forcing her to look up into his terrifying, soulless eyes. I have ended entire bloodlines for lesser insults than a sideways glance. And you? You put my daughter in the trash like she was nothing. Tears blurred Alara's vision, mixing with the soot on her cheeks. I saved her. By the gods, I saved her. Enough. Take her to the black cells, Malachar ordered, his back already turned as he followed the healers. I will extract the truth from her marrow once my daughter is stable. As the heavy iron doors of the dungeon groaned open, Alara was tossed onto the cold stone. The darkness swallowed her, but her mind raced back to the only life she had ever known, a life of debt, silence, and the desperate struggle that had led her to the palace in the first place. Before she was a traitor, she was simply Alara Vale, a girl born to nothing, who had spent every day just trying to survive the shadows of the Crimson Realm. The stone floor of the black cells was not just cold, it was a living frost that seemed to drink the warmth from Alara's marrow. She lay where she had been thrown, her face pressed against the damp grit, the metallic tang of her own blood thick on her tongue. Above her, the muffled sound of heavy boots and the rhythmic clanking of armor echoed through the vents, the sounds of a palace waking up to a nightmare. Stand up, traitor. The voice belonged to a captain of the sentinels. He didn't wait for her to comply. He gripped the iron chain connecting her makeshift shackles and hauled her upward. Alara stifled a cry as her bruised shoulder flared in protest. The journey from the dungeons to the Great Hall was designed to break a spirit before the trial even began. They didn't take the service tunnels. They dragged her through the Gilded Gallery, the primary artery of the palace, where the highborn gathered to whisper. The humiliation was absolute. Alara, still covered in the gray ash and reeking liquid of the refuse bin, was paraded past rows of velvet-clad nobles. Their faces, pale and sharp under the glow of blood crystal chandeliers, twisted in synchronized disgust. Look at the filth on her, a duchess hissed, fluttering a lace fan. To think she laid those hands on the princess. They say she meant to burn the child in the furnace, another whispered. Alara kept her head down, but her eyes traced the floor, polished obsidian that reflected her own battered image back at her. She looked like a monster. In their eyes, she already was. The rigid hierarchy of the Crimson Realm had no room for a hero in a maid's apron. It only had room for a scapegoat. The heavy double doors of the great hall groaned open. At the far end, beneath a canopy of tattered war banners, sat King Malachar. He was no longer the grieving father she had seen in the courtyard. He was a monument of ancient, terrifying power. He sat motionless on the throne, his chin resting on a fist, his crimson eyes fixed on the entrance. Beside him stood Seraphine Drax. She had changed into robes of morning white, her eyes artfully rimmed with red, as if she had spent the last hour weeping. As Alara was forced to her knees at the base of the dais, the air in the room seemed to vanish. Malachar's presence was a physical weight, a psychic pressure that made it hard to draw a full breath. Majesty, Seraphine's voice was like silk sliding over a blade. The physicians have stabilized the infant, though the poison's touch is deep. It is a miracle I arrived when I did. Had I been a moment later, this creature would have vanished into the city, leaving us to mourn an empty cradle. Malachar didn't look at Seraphine. He didn't look at the court. He looked only at Alara. I have ruled this realm for 400 years, he said, his voice a low, vibrating hum that made the crystals in the chandeliers tremble. I have survived assassinations, coups, and the collapse of empires. I thought I knew every face of evil that dared walk my halls. He stood up, descending the stairs of the dais with a predatory grace. But you, he stepped into Alara's personal space, the scent of cold rain and old parchment clinging to him. You are something new, a servant who eats my bread, who sleeps under my protection, and who repays that mercy by throwing my blood into the rock. I didn't, Alara whispered, her voice cracking. I found her. Someone else put her there. Who? Malachar barked, the sound echoing like a crack of thunder. I don't know. It was dark. I heard her cry. Liar. Seraphine stepped forward, her face contorted in righteous fury. I saw you hovering over that bin. You were making sure she had stopped breathing. You stole her from her cradle while the guards were diverted, hoping to destabilize the throne and sell her to the rebels in the Low City. The cradle was empty when I went to check on her. Elara tried to explain, looking at the king. Please, sire. Why would I stay? If I wanted to kill her, why would I be holding her to keep her warm when the guards found me? Why would I be screaming for help? Clever. The dampness of the black cells was a slow poison. For 3 days, Elara sat in the dark, her world reduced to the rhythmic drip of condensation and the agonizing throbbing of her cheek. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the flash of silver hair in the ash. Every time she woke, she felt the phantom weight of a shivering infant against her chest. She was no longer the girl who had walked into the palace to pay off her family's debt. She was a ghost, waiting for the executioner to make her status official. The heavy iron slot in her door slid open with a screech. Instead of the usual bowl of thin, gray gruel, a small, wrapped bundle of warm bread and a piece of dried apple slid through. Eat quickly, a voice whispered. It was soft, feminine. The voice of Kaylee, a kitchen maid Elara had once helped when a head cook had threatened her with the birch. Kaylee? Elara crawled to the door, her voice a raspy shadow. Is the princess alive? She breathes, Kaylee whispered, her eye visible through the slot, darting nervously. But the palace is a hornet's nest. Seraphine has the king's ear, and she's whispering poison every hour. But Elara, the servants, we know. We saw you with that baby. You didn't have the face of a killer. You had the face of a mother. They won't listen to me. Elara sobbed quietly. Then let the child speak, Kaylee said before retreating into the shadows as the heavy boots of a guard approached. That guard was Jackson, a junior sentinel with a face too young for the cruel armor he wore. He didn't speak, but he didn't strike the door with his pike like the others. He stood at attention, his shadow falling across Elara's cell like a protective bar. Through the thin stone walls, Elara heard him grunt at a senior officer. She's just a maid, sir. Does she really need a double lock? The response was a bark of laughter. She's a king killer in the making, boy. Don't let the tears fool you. While Elara withered in the dark, the truth began to fracture in the sunlit halls above. In the royal nursery, the air was thick with the scent of lavender and sterile herbs. Master Valerius, a royal healer whose family had served the Nocturne line for centuries, stood over the cradle of Princess Nisara. He was a man of science and blood magic, and something in his vials was not reacting correctly. It's a persistent fever, Seraphine said, her voice tight as she reached out to stroke the infant's brow. The moment Seraphine's fingers neared, the sleeping Nisara let out a piercing, jagged wail. Her tiny hands clawed at the air, her face twisting in a mask of primal distress. Valerius pulled a silver needle from a vial of the child's blood. The liquid was swirling with a faint, violet luminescence. Curious, he murmured, his brow furrowed. What is it? Seraphine snapped. Traces of a blood-binding sedative, Valerius said, his voice neutral, but his eyes sharp. A rare concoction. It's designed to dull the senses of a royal fledgling so they can be moved without crying out. It requires a very specific alchemical knowledge and access to the restricted apothecary. Seraphine didn't flinch, but her hand clenched the silk of her skirt. The maid must have stolen it. These commoners are like magpies with shiny vials. Perhaps, Valerius said, turning his back to hide the fact that he was glancing at the palace logbook. He had noticed a gap in the guard rotations. The East Wing had been left unguarded for exactly 20 minutes the night the princess vanished. A gap authorized by a signature he recognized all too well. Back in the bowels of the palace, Elara leaned her ear against the cold masonry. The black cells were porous. Sound traveled through the ventilation shafts like ghosts. Cries every time she enters the room? A distant voice echoed. Elara recognized it, the head housekeeper. The child won't take the bottle. She only settles when the healers mention the name of the girl in the cells. It's blood instinct. The babe knows who pulled her from the cold. Hush, another voice hissed. Seraphine has ears everywhere. She's already dismissed 3 footmen for forgetting where they were standing on the night of the incident. Alara's heart thudded. The child was reacting to her name? In the Crimson Realm, blood was everything. A vampire infant's instinct was considered a sacred, infallible truth. If Nisara was rejecting Seraphine and seeking Alara, the king's logic would have to clash with his nature. In his private study, King Malachar stared at the map of his realm, but he saw only the bruised, defiant face of the maid. He was a creature of absolute order, but the reports crossing his desk were messy. The healers were whispering. The guards were uneasy. And most damningly, every time he held his daughter, she searched the room with her wide, crimson eyes, looking for a face that wasn't there. He remembered the way Alara had held the child, not as a trophy or a tool, but as a life. He remembered the grime on her hands and the warmth she had tried to give away at the cost of her own. A shadow fell across his desk. Majesty, the junior guard, Jackson bowed low. Master Valerius requests an audience. He says the traitor's testimony regarding the time of discovery needs to be re-verified against the infant's metabolic state. Malachar's eyes flared. Bring her. The cell door groaned open, but this time there was no food slot. 2 guards entered, unceremoniously hauling Alara to her feet. Her legs gave way, and she stumbled, her knees scraping the stone. Is it time? She whispered, thinking of the executioner's block. The king wants a word, Jackson said, his voice surprisingly gentle as he steadied her arm. They didn't lead her to the great hall this time. They took the back stairs, winding through the narrow corridors of the inner sanctum. Alara was a mess, her hair matted with ash, her uniform torn, her spirit frayed to a single thread. As they reached the heavy oak doors of the king's study, Alara caught a glimpse of herself in a silver mirror. She looked like a ghost. But as the doors swung open and she saw Malachar standing there, silhouetted against the moonlight, she felt a spark of something she hadn't felt in days. It wasn't hope. It was a cold, hard clarity. She had saved that child. And if she was going to die, she was going to make sure the king knew exactly whose hands had actually been wet with his daughter's blood. Sit, Malachar commanded, pointing to a chair in the center of the room. He didn't look angry anymore. He looked like a man haunted by a truth he wasn't yet ready to admit. The door clicked shut behind her, locking her alone with the king. The heavy oak doors clicked shut, sealing the world away. In the dim, amber light of the study, King Malachar looked less like a god and more like a predator contemplating a confusing piece of prey. He did not sit. He paced the perimeter of the room, his shadows stretching long and jagged against the rows of ancient scrolls. Alara sat in the straight-backed wooden chair, her hands trembling in her lap. She didn't try to hide them. There was no point in pretending to be brave when the air itself tasted of his power. You speak now, Malachar said, his voice a low, dangerous velvet. Not for the court. Not for the guards. For me. Tell me again how you found her. Alara took a breath, the air rasping in her dry throat. She didn't plead. She didn't cry. She spoke with the flat, haunting precision of someone who had relived the moment 1,000 times in the dark. I went to the eastern wing at 11:05. I know the time because the bells had just ceased. The refuse bin was heavy. It hadn't been emptied in 2 days. When I lifted the lid, I didn't see her at first. I heard a sound like a kitten's mewl, muffled by the ash. I moved a bag of kitchen waste, and there she was. She wasn't crying anymore. She was too cold to cry. Malachar stopped pacing. His eyes narrowed. You claim you gave her rescue breaths. A maid. Where does a girl born into debt learn to pull life back into a royal fledgling? My sister, Alara said, her voice softening. She was born with a weak chest. My mother taught me how to breathe for her when she turned blue in the winters. I did for the princess what I did for Miri. I rubbed her feet to move the blood. I tucked her inside my bodice, against my skin. The heat of a servant is the same as the heat of a queen, Majesty. It's just warmth. Malakar's jaw tightened. The logic was piercingly simple. If she had intended to kill the child, she wouldn't have known or cared how to treat hypothermia. He turned away, his gaze falling on a stack of reports from the head of the guard. The surveillance crystals, he murmured, almost to himself. They were darkened for 20 minutes. The logs say it was a routine maintenance check, authorized by the High Caretaker's seal. I saw no guards, Alara added quietly. That part of the wing is usually crawling with them. That night it was silent, like the palace was holding its breath. Malakar summoned Jackson, the junior guard, through a side door. Bring me the duty roster for the night of the disappearance, and fetch Master Valerius. The next hour was a blur of hushed voices and cold revelations. Valerius arrived, carrying a ledger of the palace apothecary. He laid it open on the king's desk, pointing to a missing ounce of night sanguine, the very sedative found in Nisara's blood. Only 3 people have the key to this cabinet, sire, Valerius whispered. Myself, my senior apprentice, and the High Caretaker. Then came the servants. A kitchen maid, trembling so hard her teeth chattered, testified that she had seen Seraphine Drax heading toward the eastern refuse bins an hour before Alara's shift began. A footman admitted he had been ordered to clear the hallway by Seraphine herself, under the guise of a private royal inspection. The inconsistencies weren't just cracks, they were a canyon. The tension in the room snapped when the door burst open. Seraphine Drax entered, her face flushed, her composure fraying at the edges. She saw Alara sitting there unbound and speaking to the king, and her eyes flashed with a panicked venom. Majesty, why is this murder not in the iron chair? She is poisoning your mind just as she tried to poison your blood. Seraphine's voice was too high, too desperate. She was overplaying the role of the protector. Malakar's expression remained unreadable. She was just explaining the art of rescue breaths, Seraphine. It's a pity you didn't mention the child was blue when you found her. I was in shock. Seraphine stammered. The horror of seeing her in that girl's arms. Bring the princess, Malakar interrupted. A nursemaid entered, carrying Nisara wrapped in fresh, white linens. The moment the child entered the room, the atmosphere changed. Seraphine moved instinctively toward the bundle. Give her to me. She needs her tonic. As Seraphine reached out, Nisara, usually a placid, quiet infant, erupted. She let out a shriek so visceral it sounded like a physical blow. She kicked her tiny legs, arching her back away from Seraphine's touch, her face turning a panicked shade of red. She's just tired, Seraphine hissed, her hands shaking. The trauma of the kidnapping. Set her down, Malakar commanded. The nursemaid placed the infant on a soft velvet ottoman in the center of the room. Nisara continued to wail, her tiny fists bunched in distress. Malakar looked at Alara. A silent command. Alara stood, her legs weak, and approached the ottoman. She felt Seraphine's murderous gaze burning into her back. She knelt beside the child, and did the only thing she knew how to do. She began to hum, a low, rhythmic tune her mother used to sing in the slums. It's all right, little bird, Alara whispered. The ash is gone. You're warm now. She extended a finger. Nisara's crying didn't just stop. It vanished. The infant's wide, crimson eyes locked onto Alara's face. A tiny, pale hand reached out, grabbing Alara's finger with a grip that was surprisingly strong. Nisara let out a soft, gurgling sigh and closed her eyes, her entire body relaxing into the velvet. The silence that followed was deafening. Malakar watched the scene, his heart, a thing he had thought was made of stone, suffering a violent tremor of realization. He saw the way the child sought the maid. He saw the way his daughter felt safe with the woman he had ordered beaten. And then he looked at Seraphine. The High Caretaker was white-faced, her lips pulled back in a snarl she couldn't quite hide. At that moment, She didn't look like a devoted servant. She looked like a predator who had just lost its kill. Seraphine, Malachar said, his voice dropping to a whisper that was more terrifying than any shout. Why does my daughter fear the woman who has raised her since birth, yet sleep for the woman who supposedly tried to kill her? Majesty, it's a spell. The maid must have used some common hedge magic. Enough, Malachar roared. The shadows in the room surged, creeping up the walls like rising black water. Valerius, take the child. Jackson, return the maid to the upper cells, not the dungeons. Treat her wounds. He turned his back on them all, staring out the window at the rising moon. His crown, the symbol of his absolute authority, felt suddenly like a cage. He had spent centuries fearing the enemies at his borders, the rebels in the streets, and the rivals in his court. But as the door closed behind the guards, a single, sickening thought settled in his mind, colder than any winter frost. The person who had tried to erase his lineage wasn't a girl with ash on her hands. It was someone who sat at his table. Someone he had trusted with the only thing in the world that actually mattered. The betrayal didn't just hurt. It demanded a reckoning that would leave the palace in ruins. The Crimson Court was a cathedral of blood-red marble and sharp expectations. Usually, the convening of the High Lords was a celebration of power, but today the air was thick with a copper scent of incense and the static of an impending storm. The nobility occupied the tiered galleries, a sea of black silk and shimmering jewels. They had come for a spectacle. They had come to see the maid who had dared to touch the divine lineage of House Nocturne be scrubbed from existence. Alara stood in the center of the hall. She was no longer in the filth-stained rags of the dungeon. Jackson had provided a clean, gray servant's tunic, though no amount of soap could hide the deep purple bruise that bloomed across her cheek like a dark flower. She felt small beneath the vaulted ceiling, a single blade of grass in a hurricane. At the head of the hall sat Malachar. He wore his full regalia, obsidian armor etched with runes of old magic, his heavy velvet cloak spilling over the steps of the throne like a pool of drying blood. To his right, Seraphine Drax stood tall, her chin tilted at a haughty angle. She scanned the crowd, her eyes promising favor to her allies and ruin to her doubters. She still believed she held the leash. This court is convened to finalize the judgment of Alara Vale. Malachar's voice boomed, amplified by the acoustics of the hall. It didn't carry the heat of his earlier rage. It was cold, clinical, and terrifyingly precise. The charge is high treason, the attempted murder of Princess Nassar. A murmur of agreement rippled through the gallery. Seraphine stepped forward, her voice ringing with practiced grief. Majesty, the evidence of her presence at the bin is undisputed. Her hands were covered in the very filth she tried to bury our future in. Why prolong this? The law is clear. Blood for blood. The law is indeed clear, Seraphine, Malachar said, his eyes shifting to the master healer. Master Valerius, present your findings on the state of the princess's health. Valerius stepped into the light, holding a silver tray. Upon it sat a single, small glass vial containing a residue of deep violet liquid. The princess was not merely cold, Valerius told the court, his voice steady. She was under the influence of night sanguine, a sedative used to suppress the natural cries of a vampire fledgling. It is a poison of silence. He held up a ledger. According to the apothecary logs, an ounce of this substance was withdrawn 2 nights before the disappearance. It was not signed for by a maid. It was signed for by the office of the High Caretaker. The murmurs in the gallery shifted pitch, from bloodlust to confusion. Seraphine's hand twitched against her side. A forgery. The maid must have stolen my seal. And did she also forge the guard rotations? Malachar asked, his voice dropping an octave. Jackson stepped forward, his armor clanking in the sudden silence. He presented a scroll to the High Chancellor. The surveillance crystals in the eastern wing were deactivated by a manual override. The authorization code used was Drax 7 Alpha. Only the High Caretaker and her direct deputies possess it. Lies. Seraphine's voice cracked. She turned to the nobles, her eyes wide. Can you not see? The king is being manipulated. This girl is a vessel for the rebels. She has bewitched the guards. She turned back to Malachar, her expression shifting to one of desperate prophecy. Majesty, remember the oracle's words. A shadow shall rise from the dirt to choke the crown. This maid is that shadow. I was protecting you. I was ensuring the prophecy could not come to pass by removing the weakness from your house. It was a fatal mistake. By invoking prophecy, she had admitted to the act. The court went deathly silent. The confession hung in the air like a guillotine blade. You speak of prophecy to justify the disposal of my daughter? Malachar asked. He stood up slowly, the movement so fluid it was predatory. You speak of weakness regarding the blood I chose to bring into this world? I did it for the realm. Seraphine shrieked, her mask finally shattering. The poised noblewoman vanished, replaced by a creature of raw, jagged ambition. You have grown soft, Malachar, mourning a dead wife, doting on a mewling babe. The Crimson Realm needs a ruler of iron, not a father who lets a peasant breathe into his heir's mouth. Alara watched as the nobles in the front row recoiled. The betrayal wasn't just against the king, it was against the fundamental sanctity of the bloodline they all worshipped. Malachar looked at the High Chancellor. The verdict. The Chancellor, an ancient vampire with skin like parchment, didn't even hesitate. The evidence is absolute. The maid, Alara Vale, acted as the sole protector of the blood. The High Caretaker, Seraphine Drax, is the architect of the treason. Alara Vale, Malachar said, his gaze finally resting on the girl in gray. You are declared innocent of all charges. Your service to the crown is recognized. Alara didn't cheer. She didn't even exhale. She felt a strange, hollow numbness. She looked at the king, expecting a smile, or perhaps a sign of the mercy she had prayed for. Instead, she saw a man who had just realized his entire world was built on a foundation of vipers. Malachar's face was a mask of obsidian. He didn't look relieved. He looked like he was deciding how much of the world needed to burn to satisfy the insult. Seraphine stood trembling, her breathing ragged. She looked around the hall, searching for a friendly face, but the nobles who had been her friends moments ago now looked at her as if she were a leper. She had lost her status, her power, and her future in a single hour. I am a Drax, she whispered, her voice trembling with a final, pathetic spark of defiance. You cannot simply throw me in a cell like a commoner. I have rights. I have blood claims. Malachar descended the steps of the throne. He didn't stop until he was inches from her. He was so much taller than her, his shadow completely enveloping her. You are right, Seraphine, he said, his voice so quiet only those at the front could hear. A cell is too good for you. And blood claims, those only matter to the living. He didn't order the guards to take her away yet. He simply stood there, staring her down, his crimson eyes glowing with a light that promised something far worse than a quick death. The silence in the hall stretched, heavy and suffocating. Alara stood in the center of it all. The girl who had survived the ash, the girl who had broken a caretaker, and the girl who now realized that the king's justice was a far more terrifying thing than his wrath. Seraphine looked into Malachar's eyes and, for the first time, she saw the true depth of the void. She had won the trial of lies, but she had just entered a trial of soul-crushing retribution. She had lost the game, but she didn't yet know the price of the forfeit. The heavy silence of the Crimson Court was a physical weight, thick with the scent of ozone and the metallic tang of fear. Seraphine Drax stood trembling in the center of the marble floor, her white mourning robes now looking like a shroud. The realization of her defeat had finally pierced through her delusions of grandeur, and as King Malachar loomed over her, the highborn arrogance that had defined her for centuries began to dissolve into a frantic, jagged desperation. Majesty, please. Seraphine's voice cracked, dropping the facade of prophecy for the raw cry of a beggar. 3 centuries. I have served your house for 300 years. I was there when the crimson borders were drawn. I held your hand when the queen passed. This was a lapse in judgment, a moment of overzealous protection for the crown. Malachar remained motionless, his eyes like glowing embers in the shadow of his helm. Protection, his voice was a low, terrifying hum. You threw a child, my blood, my soul, into the waste to rot. You did not protect the crown, Seraphine. You tried to prune the tree to suit your own garden. I can fix this, she shrieked, her eyes darting to the silent nobles in the gallery. I have secrets, alliances. I know who funds the rebels in the Low City. If you kill me, that knowledge dies with me. Kill you? Malachar's lips curled into a mirthless, predatory smile. Death is a mercy for those who have at least maintained their dignity. You have forfeited yours. Malachar raised his hand, and the air in the hall grew unnaturally cold. The torches flickered and died, leaving only the eerie crimson glow of the blood crystals. Seraphine Drax, he began, his voice taking on a ceremonial resonance that vibrated in the bones of everyone present. By the power vested in the obsidian throne, I find you unworthy of the light and the dark. From this moment, you are anathema. A gasp rippled through the court. This wasn't an execution, it was a soul cleansing. I strip you of your name, Malachar declared. No chronicle shall record your deeds. No tongue shall speak your title. You are a shadow without a source. He stepped closer, his fingers glowing with a faint, necrotic light. He pressed a hand toward her chest, not touching her, but pulling at the very air around her. I strip you of your rank and blood rights. Your lands are forfeited to the crown. Your lineage is erased from the great ledger. You are a beggar in the house you thought you owned. Seraphine fell to her knees, gasping as if the very oxygen were being thinned. But Malachar was not finished. This was the part that made the High Lords turn their eyes away in terror. And finally, Malachar's voice dropped to a whisper that echoed like a scream. I strip you of your gift. I revoke the immortality granted by the Nocturne line. He reached out and physically tore a silver pendant from her neck, the focus that channeled her vampiric longevity. As the chain snapped, a visible change washed over Seraphine. The preternatural smoothness of her skin began to crack. Fine lines appeared around her eyes. Her hair lost its lustrous sheen, turning a dull, brittle gray. The centuries she had cheated began to settle on her shoulders in an instant. You are mortal now, Malachar spat, his disgust palpable. You will feel the hunger, the cold, and the eventual rot. Guards, take this nameless thing to the crimson borders. Throw her into the wastes. If she survives the sun, the sandwraiths may have what is left. As the guards dragged a screaming, aging Seraphine from the hall, her fingernails clawing at the polished marble, a profound dread settled over the assembly. Alara watched from the sidelines, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had wanted justice, but this was a divine cruelty. She looked at the nobles, many of whom had been laughing with Seraphine only hours ago. They were ashen, realizing that the king's mercy was a thin veil over an abyss of absolute power. Malachar turned back to the court, his gaze sweeping over the High Lords. The order of the royal caretakers is hereby suspended. Its members will be interrogated. Its records will be burned. From this day forward, I will trust no one with my daughter's breath, but those who have proven they value a cry over a crown. He dismissed the court with a sharp flick of his wrist. The nobles fled, disappearing into the shadows of the palace like mist before the sun, leaving the great hall echoing with a hollow, haunted silence. Finally, it was just the two of them, the king and the maid. The obsidian-clad giant stood amidst the wreckage of his own trust. He didn't move for a long time. The terrifying aura of the vampire king seemed to bleed away, leaving behind a man who looked suddenly, jarringly exhausted. Alara stood her ground, though her knees shook.
She didn't bow.
She waited. Malachar turned slowly. He looked at the bruise on her cheek, the one he had indirectly caused by his blind rage. He looked at her small, fragile frame, still draped in the gray wool of a servant. He didn't speak as a judge. He didn't speak as a god. "You were telling the truth," he said, his voice raw. It wasn't an apology. Kings of the Crimson Realm did not apologize, but it was an admission that carried the weight of one. He walked toward her, and for the first time, Alara didn't flinch. He stopped 3 paces away, his crimson eyes searching hers, looking for the spark of defiance he had seen in the study. "I nearly ended the only hand that reached for my daughter in the dark," he murmured. The guilt in his eyes was a jagged, piercing thing. "I believed a lie because it was wrapped in silk, and I ignored the truth because it was covered in ash." Alara looked up at him, her voice steady despite the lingering fear. "A crown is a heavy thing, Majesty. It makes it hard to hear anything below the throne." The king's expression shifted, a flicker of something that might have been respect, or perhaps a new kind of pain. He reached into his belt and pulled out a small, silken pouch, but he paused, realizing that gold was a poor balm for the spirit he had tried to break. "What happens now?" Alara asked. Malachar looked toward the nursery towers where the sun was beginning to touch the spires. "Now," he said softly, "the realm learns that a maid's word can topple a caretaker. And I learn how to live with the debt I owe a girl who has nothing." He reached out, his hand hovering near her shoulder as if he wanted to offer comfort but had forgotten how to be gentle. Then he let it drop. "Come. My daughter is awake, and she is asking for you." The nursery was bathed in the soft, bruised light of a rising sun. For Alara, the transition from the cold marble of the high court to this sanctuary of velvet and lavender felt like waking from a fever. In the center of the room, Nisara lay in a cradle of carved ivory, her tiny chest rising and falling in the deep, restorative sleep of a child who finally felt safe. King Malachar stood by the window, his obsidian armor catching the dawn. He looked out at his sprawling empire, but his reflection in the glass was haunted. "You have been through an ordeal that would have broken most soldiers," Malachar said, his voice low so as not to wake the infant. He turned to face Alara, and for the first time, he didn't look down at her. He looked at her. "My treasurer has already prepared the deeds. There is a manor in the sunlit province, far from the political rod of this palace. It comes with a life stipend, a title of nobility, and guards to ensure no one ever looks at you with anything but respect again." He stepped forward, holding out a heavy parchment sealed with the royal crest. It was more than a gift. It was a kingdom's ransom. To a girl born to debt, it was the answer to every prayer she had ever breathed into the dark. Alara looked at the parchment. She looked at the gold-embossed letters and the promise of a life where she would never have to touch ash again. Then she looked at her hands. They were clean now, but the memory of the cold refuse bin was still etched into her skin. "No," she said. The word was small, but in the silence of the nursery, it rang like a bell. Malachar's brow furrowed. "Perhaps you did not hear me. I am offering you a seat among the highborn. I am erasing your debts, your past, and your invisibility. You will never have to serve another soul for as long as you live." "And what will that gold buy me, Majesty?" Alara asked, her voice gaining a strength that made the king pause. "Will it buy back the moment your guard struck me while I was trying to save your blood? Will it erase the hours I spent in the black cells, listening to the dampness and wondering if the child I saved was already dead because you were too proud to listen?" Malachar's expression stiffened. "I acted on the evidence I was given. I protected my house." "You protected your ego," Alara countered. She took a step toward him, her small frame defiant against his towering presence. "You saw a maid in the dirt and a noblewoman in silk. You made a choice based on a hierarchy that has no room for the truth." She looked toward the cradle, her eyes softening as they rested on Nisara. "You offered me land to go away. You offered me gold to forget. But you haven't offered the one thing that actually has value. And what is that? Malachar asked, his voice strained. The truth, Elara said. I don't want your titles. I don't want to be a duchess in a province I've never seen. I want every person in this palace to know that they didn't mistakenly arrest a maid. I want them to know that their king, the feared Malachar Nocturne, was wrong, and that the only person who cared for the future of this realm was the girl who cleans the hearths. She looked him directly in the eye, her voice dropping to a jagged, painful whisper. You believed a crown before a cry. The silence that followed was absolute. Malachar looked as though he had been struck, not by a hand, but by a mirror. The line defined the chasm between them. He had been so preoccupied with the dignity of his bloodline and the sanctity of his throne that he had failed the most basic instinct of a father. He had prioritized the symbol over the soul. For a long moment, Elara expected him to snap. She expected the shadow magic to rise and the king to reclaim his terrifying authority. But the darkness stayed still. You demand no forgiveness, Malachar said, a strange, hollow wonder in his voice. Forgiveness is for those who seek it, Majesty. I seek justice. Not just for me, but for the girl who will take my place at the refuse bins tomorrow. Malachar bowed his head. It was a slight movement, almost imperceptible, but for a king who had not bowed in 4 centuries, it was an earthquake. The deeds will be rescinded, he said quietly. Instead, a royal decree will be read at midday. Your innocence will not just be recorded, it will be proclaimed. The world will know that the savior of House Nocturne is Elara Vale. You are free to leave or free to stay. The palace doors are no longer your cage. He turned back to the window, his shoulders heavy. I cannot give you back the hours in the dark, Elara. I can only offer you my word that I will never again let the weight of this crown deafen me to the truth. He signaled to the guards outside the door. Release her. Ensure her passage to the servants' quarters is unhindered. And tell the court, the maid is to be treated as a guest of the throne. Elara didn't wait for a further dismissal. She walked toward the cradle one last time. Nisara's eyes fluttered open, tiny, crimson pools of curiosity. The child didn't cry. She reached out a small, pale hand, her fingers brushing against Elara's sleeve. Elara let out a breath she felt she had been holding since the night in the ash. She gently squeezed the infant's hand, then turned and walked out of the room. She walked through the marble halls, past the guards who now averted their eyes in shame, and past the nobles who whispered in hushed, fearful tones. She didn't head for the main gates, and she didn't head for the treasury. She went back to the only place she knew. As she entered the servants' quarters, the kitchen was silent. Kaylee, the maid who had smuggled her bread, looked up from a pot of soup, her eyes wide. Elara? They said you were freed. I am, Elara said, sitting at the rough wooden table where she had spent 1,000 nights in invisibility. She was no longer a prisoner. She was no longer an accused killer. But as she looked at her reflection in a copper kettle, clean but scarred, she realized she was no longer just a maid, either. She had challenged a king and won her dignity, but in the Crimson Realm, dignity was a dangerous thing to own. She was free, but she was no longer sure where she belonged. Between the palace she had outgrown and the world that had tried to throw her away, Elara Vale was a girl standing in the dawn, waiting to see if the realm would truly change, or if she would have to change the realm herself. The proclamation did not come with the festive trill of trumpets. It came with a heavy, rhythmic tolling of the great bell, a sound usually reserved for the death of a monarch or the declaration of war. In the center of the capital, beneath the shadow of the palace spires, the commoners gathered in the rain. They stood in the mud of the low city, their faces weary and hollowed by debt, looking up at the high stone balcony where King Malachar stood. He was flanked not by the high caretakers or the gleaming lords of the council, but by a single girl in a gray wool tunic. Malachar's voice was carried by magic, amplified until it vibrated in the chests of every soul within 5 miles. The lie is dead, the king declared. My daughter, Princess Nisara lives. She was not taken by rebels, nor was she harmed by the girl who stands beside me. She was discarded by the very institution sworn to protect her. The caretakers are disbanded. Their titles are void. A shocked, suffocating silence fell over the square. But it was the next sentence that caused the realm to tremble. And because a crown failed where a common heart prevailed, I named Alara Vale as the guardian of the air. She shall hold the keys to the nursery and the ear of the throne. Let it be known, in this realm, the cry of the innocent shall henceforth carry more weight than the blood of the ancient. Inside the palace, the atmosphere was not one of silent shock, but of mounting, jagged fury. The Crimson Court had become a powder keg. "This is madness," Lord Vane hissed, his fingers white where they gripped the hilt of his ceremonial sword. He stood in the solar with a dozen other high-ranking nobles, their faces illuminated by the flickering hearth. To name a maid, a girl who smells of ash and dishwater, as the guardian of a royal fledgling, it is an insult to every drop of noble blood in the Crimson Realm. "It is worse than an insult," Lady Hespera whispered, her eyes narrow and predatory. "It is a structural collapse. If a servant can topple a caretaker, what is to stop our own housemaids from looking us in the eye? Malachar has invited the rot into the foundation." By nightfall, the first alliances began to fracture. Messengers on bat-winged steeds blurred across the moonlit sky, carrying secret missives to the border lords. The message was clear. The king has lost his mind to grief. The throne is soft. The blood is thin. While the world outside ignited, Alara moved through the royal apartments like a ghost in her own life. She had been moved from the servants' quarters to a suite adjacent to the nursery. It was filled with silk tapestries and silver basins, yet she felt more out of place here than she ever had in the black cells. She looked at the heavy iron keys hanging from her belt, the keys to the princess's safety. They felt like lead. "You aren't eating," a voice said from the doorway. Alara turned to see Jackson, the guard who had shown her mercy. He looked tired. The entire palace guard was on high alert, bracing for the inevitable backlash. "I don't know how to be a guardian, Jackson," Alara said, looking at the fine lace on the bed she was supposed to sleep in. "I know how to scrub floors. I know how to listen for a child's breath in the dark. But I don't know how to face a room full of lords who want me dead." "You already did that," Jackson reminded her, stepping into the room. "You faced the king when he had a sword in your spirit. The lords are just jackals. They're loud, but they're cowards." "They aren't just loud," Alara said, glancing toward the window. Down in the city, orange flickers of torchlight were spreading. "They're starting fires." The structural changes were immediate and violent. Malachar had opened the palace records, allowing commoners to petition for the release of family members held in debt slavery, a move that struck at the very bank accounts of the nobility. In response, the bread riots began. Noble-controlled granaries were mysteriously locked. Rumors were fed to the starving masses that the Maid Guardian was a witch who had hexed the king, causing the famine. Alara walked the nursery floor that night, holding Nisara. The infant was healthy, her crimson eyes tracking the shadows on the ceiling. Outside, the sound of distant shouting drifted up from the city walls. Alara looked down at the child. "They hate us, little bird," she whispered. "They hate me for being nothing, and they hate you for needing me." She realized then that her role wasn't just to watch over a cradle. She was the physical manifestation of the king's guilt and his new, radical justice. As long as she stood beside the throne, the old world couldn't return to its comfortable cruelties. King Malachar entered the nursery late, his armor still splattered with the mud of the city. He had spent the evening suppressing a riot at the western gate, one led by his own cousins. He stood beside Alara, both of them looking out at the flickering horizon. The Crimson Realm was no longer a monolith of absolute order. It was a fractured mirror, reflecting 1,000 different angles. "The lords have called for a council of blood," Malachar said, his voice weary. "They intend to challenge your appointment. They claim it violates the founding statutes." Will you rescind it? Alara asked. Malachar looked at his daughter, then at the girl who had saved her. He saw the bruise on Alara's face, fading but still there, a permanent reminder of his own failure. If I rescind it, I admit that the crown is a lie, he said. If I keep it, I invite a civil war that may burn this realm to the ground. He turned to Alara, his eyes searching hers. Are you afraid? I've been afraid since the moment I heard her cry in the ash, Alara said. Fear doesn't change the truth. It just makes the truth harder to hold on to. Malachar nodded slowly. He reached out and placed a hand on the hilt of his sword. Then we hold on, until the world stops shaking, or until it breaks. As the bells began to toll again, this time signaling a midnight alarm, Alara clutched Nisara tighter. The air was thick with the scent of smoke and the electric charge of a coming storm. The justice she had won was no longer a personal victory. It was the first spark of a revolution. Peace was a memory. The only question left was whether the Crimson Realm would be reborn in the fire, or if it would simply become the ash from which Alara had first pulled the princess. The great bell had finally ceased its frantic clanging, replaced by the heavy, rhythmic tolling of a new day. It was a sound that didn't signal victory or defeat, but endurance. As the sun began to bleed over the jagged horizon of the Crimson Realm, the smoke from the night's riots hung in the valleys like a tattered gray shroud, slowly being burned away by the light. In the high nursery, the air was still. The chaos of the Council of Blood and the fury of the rebelling lords felt miles away, though the scorched scent of the city still clung to the curtains. Alara sat in a low chair by the balcony, the weight of Princess Nisara a warm, solid reality in her arms. She was exhausted, a deep, soul-aching weariness that made her bones feel like lead, but she didn't dare close her eyes. She watched the light catch the silver strands of the infant's hair, marveling at how something so small had managed to crack the foundations of an empire. Nisara stirred, her tiny face scrunching before her eyes opened. Those crimson eyes, once wide with the terror of the cold ash, now drifted lazily until they found Alara's face. The child let out a soft, contented sound, a tiny coo that was louder to Alara than any royal decree. The infant reached out, her small, pale hand fumbling through the air until her fingers found Alara's index finger. She gripped it with a fierce, instinctive strength. It wasn't the grip of a royal heir claiming property. It was the grip of a child who knew exactly who had kept the heartbeat going when the world had tried to stop it. Alara felt a lump form in her throat. She had spent her life being told that her hands were meant only for labor, for scrubbing, lifting, and discarding. But as Nisara held on, Alara realized that these were the only hands in the realm that didn't want something from the child. They were hands that only knew how to hold. A shadow fell across the threshold of the nursery. Alara didn't need to turn to know it was Malachar. She could feel the cooling of the air, the subtle shift in the room's gravity that always accompanied the vampire king. He didn't come closer. He stood in the archway, his obsidian armor removed, wearing a simple tunic of charcoal silk. Without the jagged crown and the high-collared mantle, he looked jarringly human, a father watching a miracle he felt he no longer had the right to touch. He watched the way Alara leaned her head back, her eyes closed for a brief second as she hummed a low, tuneless melody to his daughter. He watched the way the maid guardian didn't bow when he entered, not out of disrespect, but because her priority was the sleeping life in her lap. Malachar didn't intervene. He didn't offer gold, and he didn't offer commands. He simply stood in the quiet of the morning, a witness to the moral clarity that had eluded him for centuries. He had ruled through fear and blood, believing that power was the only shield. But looking at the girl from the ash heaps holding his legacy, he realized he had been wrong. Power could build a palace, but only mercy could keep the life inside it warm. Alara looked out at the spires of the capital. The realm was changed, but the cost had been high. There would be more riots. There would be more whispers of civil war. The nobility would not forget the humiliation of Seraphine, nor would they forgive the elevation of a maid. She thought of her sister, Mary, and her mother. She thought of the thousands of invisible girls still emptying bins in the pale hours before dawn. I didn't choose this, Alara thought. I just chose not to walk away. She realized then that survival in the Crimson Realm wasn't just about staying alive. It was about refusing to let the world turn your heart into stone. She had paid for this seat with bruises and blood, but as she felt the steady pulse of the princess against her skin, she knew she would do it all again. Not for the title, not for the king, but for the cry in the dark that no one else chose to hear. The story of the Crimson Realm would be told in many ways in the years to come. The poets would speak of the Night of the Ash, and the historians would debate the political fallout of the caretaker's fall. But the truth of it was simpler. It was the image of a maid who had done the right thing when it was the hardest thing in the world to do. It was the image of a king who had looked into the eyes of a servant and realized he was the one who was small. And as the sun finally climbed above the palace walls, illuminating the two of them, the guardian and the heir, it was the image of a realm that would never, ever forget the day a discarded child reshaped its fate. Alara tightened her hold on Isara as the bells rang out one final time, a clear, high note that signaled the start of a long, difficult peace. The maid didn't look back at the throne. She looked forward into the light. A maid who did the right thing, and a realm that will never be the same. Thank you so much for staying until the very end of this journey with me today. If Alara's bravery moved you, don't forget to subscribe and share this story with someone who needs to hear it. To my wonderful family watching from all over the world, your support is what keeps these stories alive. Be sure to check back tomorrow, because I have a brand new story about a forgotten heir and a secret that was hidden for decades. You won't want to miss a single second of it. Until then, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next story.